"Get off my property!" I screamed. But by the time I reached the kitchen, Jake's arm was already bending the wrong way. Two men in matching khaki uniforms stood over him, calm as executioners. One had a clipboard, the other a badge clipped to his chest that read Community Standards Enforcement Division. Their composure was chilling, like they'd done this before. The house smelled of burnt coffee and panic. Jake's face was pale, slick with sweat, his mouth open in a silent scream that would haunt me long after that day. "Who are you people?" I shouted, grabbing my phone to call 911. The taller one glanced at me with a cold bureaucratic tone that didn't match the violence in his eyes. "You've been issued multiple warnings, ma'am. This is what happens when residents refuse to comply with HOA standards." I froze, my mind trying to catch up. HOA standards? These men were talking about our homeowners association as if it were a federal agency. And then I saw it. A laminated ID badge swinging from his vest. It had an official seal, barcodes, a county logo. Except, I'd worked for the county once. That department didn't exist. I lunged toward Jake, but the shorter man stepped between us. "Stay back, ma'am. Your husband resisted an inspection." My husband resisted? He'd been home repairing a kitchen cabinet. The words made no sense, but the scene told the truth. They'd come here to hurt us. "You think you can expose this neighborhood and just walk away?" The tall one hissed quietly before they turned and walked out through the front door as calmly as they'd arrived. The sound of their boots on the tile still echoes in my head. Steady, unhurried, confident. Jake was gasping, half-conscious, his arm bent at a grotesque angle. "Melissa," he groaned. "They said Kingsley sent them." My stomach dropped. Robert Kingsley, the man who'd run our HOA like his personal empire for the past decade. The one I'd been investigating for financial fraud on my legal blog. I'd always thought his threats were verbal, political. I never imagined they'd turn physical. I called 911, but every second waiting for that operator felt like a lifetime. When the paramedics finally arrived, they treated it like another suburban emergency. Calm, detached, almost routine. "What happened?" one of them asked as if Jake had tripped off a ladder. "They said they were with the HOA," I said, holding up the badge one of the attackers had dropped. The medic's expression faltered. "Ma'am, this looks fake." His tone said what my heart already knew. Whoever they were, they'd been hired. This wasn't random. When the police finally came, they were polite, professional, and completely useless. One officer flipped through the badge documentation and said, "Ma'am, it's a forgery. We'll log it as an assault by impersonation." I asked if they'd look into Robert Kingsley, the HOA president who'd just been publicly accused of embezzling millions in my latest post. The officer hesitated. "Without evidence linking him directly, there's not much we can do right now." I looked around my kitchen. The spilled coffee, Jake's broken tools, the scent of disinfectant mixing with blood. My world felt smaller, colder, and suddenly fragile. I'd spent years uncovering corruption in other people's neighborhoods, but now it was in mine. And the man behind it didn't just want my silence. He wanted my fear. When I picked up that fake badge and felt the weight of its plastic in my hand, I understood something I'd never felt before. The rules I believed in no longer applied here. The law had limits. Fear didn't, and as I watched Jake's ambulance disappear down the street, one thought burned through my mind like fire. I wasn't going to the police for help. I was going to war. When I picked up that fake badge, I didn't realize I'd just declared war on my own neighborhood. All I did was publish one blog post. Where did $3.6 million go? And the next day, my husband was in the ER. That's how fast truth becomes dangerous when you're living under a corrupt HOA. I never set out to expose anyone. Household justice started as a side project after I left the prosecutor's office. A small blog meant to help regular homeowners understand their legal rights. But the audience grew faster than I expected. Within 3 years, I had 500,000 readers who relied on my posts to navigate HOA abuse, shady contractors, and the endless fine print of suburban life. People trusted me. They believed in accountability. So when our own HOA started bleeding us dry, I did what I'd always done. I followed the money. The first red flag appeared in our monthly statement. Our dues had jumped from $200 to $800 in just 2 years. No new amenities, no new security, no visible improvements. The explanation? Beautification and community enhancements. It sounded harmless enough until I requested the financial reports, a right every resident legally has under the HOA bylaws. That's when things got strange. The treasurer told me the records were under review. Robert Kingsley, our HOA president, brushed me off with his trademark smile. "You wouldn't understand the complexities of neighborhood management, Melissa," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. That was his mistake. I'd spent years dissecting fraudulent budgets and corrupt contracts. I understood plenty. After 2 months of stonewalling, I filed a public records request through the county. What I received made my blood run cold. Hundreds of pages of invoices tied to companies no one in the neighborhood had ever heard of. Metrobrook Community Enhancements, Suburban Development Partners, Green Horizons, Urban Renewal. Every one of them billed the HOA for the same project, the Maple Hollow Memorial Rose Garden. According to those documents, that patch of flowers near the entrance of our community had cost $3.6 million. I stared at the figure again and again, certain it had to be a typo. It wasn't. I walked to that garden myself the next morning. 15 rose bushes, a sprinkler system, a stone plaque. Maybe $10,000 worth of work, not millions. That night, I published the article. Where did $3.6 million go? It wasn't angry or emotional, just facts, dates, and scanned invoices. Within 24 hours, it exploded. Over 200,000 views. Comments poured in from across the country. People sharing their own HOA nightmares. Local journalists started calling. Even a county inspector emailed me privately, saying, "You might have just stumbled onto something big." I remember Jake laughing, saying, "Babe, you just woke up the whole neighborhood." But not everyone was laughing. By the second day, the tone of the board meetings had changed. Robert's usual charm had hardened into quiet hostility. He'd stand at the front of the room, smile frozen in place, and talk about misinformation campaigns, threatening the integrity of the community. He warned residents about outside influences spreading lies. But everyone knew who he was talking about. Me. Neighbors whispered in grocery aisles. Some thanked me, others avoided me. Then, the legal letter started, a cease and desist from the HOA's attorney claiming defamation. Threats of a civil suit for disrupting community harmony. Robert even called Jake one night, his voice smooth as oil. "You really should convince your wife to focus on more positive projects," he said. "People who stir trouble tend to regret it." Jake slammed the phone down, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He knew how these things could escalate. Still, I didn't back down. The truth was out there now, and it wasn't just my fight anymore. Every time I logged into Household Justice, more messages appeared from homeowners begging me to keep digging, pleading for someone to hold their HOAs accountable. For the first time, I realized how many people lived under the same quiet tyranny, too scared to speak. I told myself exposure would protect me, that shining a light would keep the darkness at bay. I was wrong. It didn't make me safe. It made me the target. Robert slammed his gavel so hard the boardroom echoed. "Mrs. Evans, if you keep pushing, you'll regret it." His voice was calm, measured, but his eyes were ice. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, their gazes dropping to the table like children avoiding a teacher's wrath. Robert smiled then, but it was the kind of smile you only see on men who think they own the room. That was the day I stopped believing he was just another overconfident HOA president. He wasn't managing a neighborhood. He was running a racket. Robert Kingsley had a way of making you feel small without ever raising his voice. Early 50s, silver hair perfectly styled, cufflinks flashing under the fluorescent lights. The kind of man who'd learned that intimidation looks better in a suit. He'd built a reputation as a pillar of the community, a generous donor to local charities, a widower who loved hosting garden parties for veterans and school teachers. But beneath that polished exterior was something calculating, something cold. He didn't need to shout. He just waited for silence, and people always gave it to him. At every meeting, he'd quote HOA bylaws like scripture, twisting words until they fit whatever narrative he wanted. The board reserves the right to allocate funds as it deems necessary for community development, he'd recite, dismissing every question about missing money with bureaucratic precision. When I pressed for transparency, he'd turn to the crowd and say, "I appreciate Mrs. Evans's enthusiasm, but we mustn't let misinformation threaten community harmony." The audience would murmur their agreement, and I'd feel the isolation setting in, like I'd just been branded the neighborhood troublemaker. It was manipulation at its finest. He used charm the way others use weapons. To my face, he'd call me dear, and thank me for my dedication to civic duty. Behind closed doors, he was spreading rumors that my blog was a hate campaign against local leadership. My mailbox filled with anonymous letters, some accusing me of tax evasion, others warning that the IRS would soon come knocking. Then came the bogus legal documents, cease and desist orders that looked official until my old contacts at the courthouse confirmed they were fakes. Someone had gone to great lengths to make them convincing. I started receiving strange phone calls at odd hours. Heavy breathing, then a click. Jake began noticing unfamiliar cars idling near our house late at night. At first, he brushed it off as paranoia, but when our trash bins were overturned 3 nights in a row and someone spray-painted "liar" on our fence, he stopped pretending it was coincidence. I tried to laugh it off, to tell him fear was exactly what Robert wanted from us. But deep down, I was rattled. Robert wasn't just fighting back. He was tightening his grip. Jake finally sat me down one night at the kitchen table, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Melissa," he said softly, "maybe it's time to let this go. We proved he's dirty. Let the county handle it." I looked at him, my husband, the man I loved, the man whose arm still ached from the assault, and I knew he was right in every rational sense. But I also knew that if I backed down, Robert would win. Not just against me, but against every homeowner who ever tried to question him. So I told Jake what I'd already decided. If I stop now, we lose everything. Not just our money, but our voice. He didn't argue. He just looked at me with that expression. That said, he knew I was going to keep fighting no matter what it cost. And that's when Robert decided to stop hiding behind paperwork and start using force. "Put your hands where I can see them," one shouted. And before Jake could react, his arms snapped like dry wood. The sound carried through the house, sharp and sickening. Later, when I replayed the security footage, I realized how fast it all happened. 2 men, early 40s, dressed in khaki uniforms with black gloves and laminated badges that looked city-issued. They moved with military precision, efficient, cold, and confident. Jake had been home alone that morning, repairing a cabinet hinge in the kitchen. The men arrived just after 10, claiming they were officers from the HOA Compliance Division. They told him there had been a formal complaint about online defamation against the community's leadership. My blog. One of them read from a clipboard, his tone official. "Your wife, Melissa Evans, has been spreading false information that violates HOA bylaws related to community harmony." Jake thought it was some kind of prank. "You can tell Robert Kingsley I'm not intimidated," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. That's when the taller man stepped forward, his face expressionless. "Wrong answer." The next moments were chaos. One grabbed Jake's wrist, twisting it behind his back until the bone gave way with a snap. Jake's scream, I can still hear it in my head, raw and human, like something primal had been torn out of him. The shorter man leaned close and whispered something I wouldn't learn until hours later. "Tell your wife to stop digging." Then they turned, walked out the door, and disappeared like ghosts. When I came home 30 minutes later, the house was quiet. Too quiet. My keys slipped from my hands when I saw him on the floor, his face ashen, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. There was blood on the tile where he'd fallen trying to catch himself. I knelt beside him, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. Jake could barely speak, but when he did, his words chilled me. They said they were HOA officers. They wanted you to stop. The paramedics arrived quickly, but they looked confused when I showed them the badge one of the men had dropped. It looked official. Seal, barcode, holographic overlay. But the medic frowned. "Ma'am, I've never heard of this department. Community Standards Enforcement?" He handed it to the responding police officer, who glanced at it once and shrugged. "Looks like a forgery. Probably impersonation." His tone was clinical, almost bored. To him, it was just another suburban disturbance. To me, it was proof that Robert Kingsley had finally crossed a line. I asked the officer if they'd investigate Robert directly, told him about the threats, the harassment, the legal letters. He promised to file a report, but I could see it in his face. This wasn't going anywhere. When I pressed him, he said, "Without evidence tying him to the suspects, there's not much we can do, ma'am." That night, the house felt haunted. Jake's blood was still faintly visible in the grout even after I scrubbed the floor twice. His tools lay scattered. One of them snapped in half. Like his arm, the air smelled like antiseptic and dread. Every creak in the walls sounded like boots on tile. I sat at the kitchen table, that fake badge in front of me, its edges catching the light. It was plastic, but heavy, weighted with meaning. I'd spent my entire career believing in due process, in systems of justice designed to protect the innocent. But now those systems were shrugging at me. If justice wouldn't come in a badge, I'd call someone who didn't need one. "Who hurt him?" Tank growled through the phone. 20 minutes later, the sound of Harley engines answered for him. I could hear them before I saw them. That deep, rumbling thunder of steel and vengeance that made windows tremble. 12 bikes pulled into the hospital parking lot like an army on parade, chrome gleaming under the afternoon sun. Nurses stopped in their tracks. Visitors froze mid-step. Every head turned, and leading them was my cousin, Tank Rodriguez. 6'4", 250 pounds of muscle and scars, his leather jacket embroidered with the insignia of the Iron Vultures motorcycle club. Tank had been a detective once, a damn good one, until the system burned him out. He'd spent 10 years chasing human monsters for the city's homicide division before deciding to fight on his own terms. Now, he led a tight brotherhood of veterans, ex-cops, and mechanics who had one rule above all: protect your own. When I called him and told him what happened to Jake, I didn't need to explain. I barely said 10 words before he went quiet. That silence, heavy, controlled, was Tank's way of promising war. He met me outside the hospital doors, eyes hard beneath his mirrored sunglasses. "You okay?" he asked, voice low, steady. I shook my head. "Jake's in surgery. They broke it clean through." Tank clenched his jaw, looking like he was swallowing back the urge to put his fist through the wall. "Show me what they left." I handed him the fake badge inside a plastic evidence bag. He studied it for less than a second before muttering, "This isn't local. Whoever made this knew what they were doing." Inside the hospital room, Jake was barely conscious, painkillers dulling his face into pale stillness. The sight of him like that, hooked to IV lines, his arms suspended in a cast, made Tank's expression darken. He placed a hand on Jake's good shoulder and said softly, "You hang in there, brother. I'll take care of this." Jake tried to speak, but Tank stopped him. "Don't waste your breath. The men who did this, they already signed their own sentence." We moved into the hallway, where the rest of the Iron Vultures waited. They weren't your cliché outlaws. They were disciplined, organized, loyal to a fault. Some were ex-Marines, others former cops who'd seen too much bureaucracy to believe in it anymore. The moment Tank told them what happened, the atmosphere changed. No shouting, no theatrics, just quiet understanding. Family had been attacked. That was all that mattered. Rico, Tank's younger cousin and the club's unofficial tech specialist, examined the fake badge on a tablet scanner he pulled from his backpack. Within minutes, he confirmed what Tank suspected. Military-grade lamination, false holographic seals, and federal barcode formatting. he said, shaking his head. Whoever printed this had serious resources. He looked up at me. You're not dealing with some neighborhood thug, Melissa. Someone funded this. Tank turned toward me, eyes blazing. This Robert Kingsley guy. He's the HOA president, right? The one you've been writing about? I nodded. Then he's our starting point, Tank said flatly. Nobody hurts family. Not ever. The next few hours moved in a blur. I gave him every document I had. The HOA invoices, the shell company records, the blog posts that had triggered all this chaos. The bikers copied everything into their own network. We'll handle it from here, Tank told me, voice calm but deadly certain. You just take care of Jake. I stood by the hospital window as they left, the low roar of 12 Harley-Davidsons fading into the distance. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel powerless. I felt something else, the kind of fire that comes from knowing you're no longer fighting alone. That night, 12 bikes rolled down our street, and every lie Robert Kingsley built began to tremble. Rico cracked his knuckles over the keyboard. Let's see what your HOA president's hiding under his fancy suits. His voice was calm, confident, almost amused, like he'd done this 100 times before. He was nothing like Tank. Clean-cut, quiet, wearing wire-rimmed glasses instead of a leather vest. But there was steel behind his calm, the kind that comes from knowing you can take down empires with a few lines of code. We set up in my living room, laptops spread across the table, screens glowing in the dim light. Outside, 2 of Tank's bikers kept watch from their parked Harleys, their silhouettes framed by the orange flicker of cigarettes. The whole neighborhood was asleep, but inside my house, the war had just gone digital. Rico's fingers flew across the keyboard. HOA servers are sloppy, he muttered. They think passwords are security. Cute. Within minutes, he'd bypassed the firewall protecting Maple Hollow's financial records. A flood of spreadsheets, transaction logs, and internal emails poured across the screen. Too much data for any one person to hide, unless they thought no one would ever look. There, he said, zooming in on a list of recurring payments. See these names? Metrobrook Community Enhancements, Green Horizons, Suburban Development Associates, all shell companies. He cross-referenced them against federal databases, shaking his head. None of these businesses exist outside the HOA's financial statements, but they've all received large wire transfers, 6 figures at a time. He clicked through a few more windows and then froze. And this one's in crypto. The payment trail led to an encrypted wallet belonging to someone named Max Steele. At first, I thought it was a joke. Max Steele? I said. That sounds like a bad action movie. Rico didn't smile. He's real, or at least the account is. It's linked to 2 other wallets I've seen in contractor blacklists, ex-military, private enforcement circles. His tone darkened. This is your guy, the one who broke Jake's arm. He kept digging, tracing the digital fingerprints backward. Melissa, you need to see this, he said quietly. On the screen appeared a name that froze the air in my lungs. Kevin Walsh. I knew that name. He was a freelance journalist who had gone missing a year and a half ago while investigating municipal fraud in nearby Oak Ridge. Rico opened an archived file, Kevin's last article draft, auto-saved in a cloud folder linked to one of Robert Kingsley's accounts. The title read, The Suburban Money Laundering Machine. Rico looked at me, his face grave. His last phone ping was at Kingsley's property the night he vanished. For a long moment I couldn't speak. The numbers and names on the screen blurred into something monstrous. A map of greed, silence, and blood. This wasn't just corruption anymore. It was something much darker. Rico leaned back in his chair, closing his laptop. Your HOA president didn't just steal money, Melissa. He buried people who got too close. We didn't threaten him. We didn't touch him. We just parked 12 bikes outside his mansion and let fear do the rest. The first night the Iron Vultures showed up, the hum of Harley engines filled the cul-de-sac like thunder rolling in from nowhere. Tank's men didn't say a word. They just leaned against their bikes, arms folded, helmets reflecting the mansion's porch lights. No laws were broken, No lines were crossed. Just a simple, undeniable message. We know. At first, Robert tried to pretend it didn't bother him. His blinds stayed open, his front lights blazing like a stage set. But by the third night, the curtains were drawn tight, and he was pacing behind them like a trapped animal. His neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Callahan from across the street whispered that the HOA king had stopped showing up to his beloved garden club. A few residents even approached me privately, asking if I thought the rumors about missing funds were true. I didn't have to answer. The fear spreading through the neighborhood was enough. Tank's operation was surgical. Each day, 2 riders would switch shifts, making sure Robert never stepped outside without seeing a Harley somewhere nearby. At the grocery store, at the gas station, even outside his gym, the Iron Vultures were always there, calm, watchful, silent. They weren't stalking him. They were mirroring his own intimidation tactics back at him. And it worked. Within a week, Robert's perfect suburban composure began to crumble. The HOA meetings he used to dominate turned chaotic. He arrived late, stuttering through his presentations, snapping at residents who dared to question him. The charm was gone, replaced by paranoia. He kept insisting there were criminal elements trying to destroy his reputation. But no one believed him anymore. Meanwhile, Rico was waging his own private war from behind a screen. He'd found a way into Robert's smart home system. Cameras, lights, speakers, thermostat. All of it vulnerable. You'd be surprised how careless rich men get with passwords, he told me. The first move was subtle, his lights flickering randomly at 3:00 a.m. The next night, the TV in his study turned itself on, looping an old local news report about the missing journalist, Kevin Walsh. Then came the whispers. Short audio clips of Kevin's voice asking questions about HOA finances, replayed softly through Robert's smart speakers in the dead of night. It wasn't just revenge, it was psychological warfare. We were showing Robert what it felt like to lose control, to feel the walls closing in and not know where the attack was coming from. Rico monitored the security feed through Robert's own cameras, watching him stumble through the house in his robe, checking locks, trembling hands gripping a glass of whiskey. The man who once ruled our neighborhood like a dictator was now terrified of his own shadows, but paranoia is a double-edged blade. The more fear ate at him, the more reckless he became. He started calling emergency board meetings at midnight, firing longtime allies, accusing everyone of betrayal. At one point, he tried to hire private security, but they quit after 2 days, spooked by the bikers' constant presence. The cracks in his empire were spreading fast, and he was running out of people to trust. Then one night, around 2 a.m., Rico called me. His voice was calm but electric. "Melissa, he just made a call," he said, "to someone named Max Steele." I froze. "Are you sure?" Rico nodded. "Oh, I'm sure. I traced it through his encrypted line. Kingsley's scared, desperate, and he's reaching out to the same man who broke Jake's arm." Robert's mistake finally had a name. And Rico caught it live. "You think I don't keep insurance?" Max sneered, sliding a flash drive across the diner table. Robert's voice is all over it. His words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with danger and truth. The place smelled of burnt coffee and grease, the kind of roadside diner where deals are made by men who don't trust offices or witnesses. Tank sat across from him, arms folded, eyes unblinking. Rico and I listened from a nearby booth, the faint hum of the neon sign outside flickering against the window. This was the man who'd broken my husband's arm. The enforcer Robert Kingsley had hired to silence me. Rico had already confirmed Max's name through digital forensics. "He's ex-military," Rico had explained earlier, contracted out to private security firms. No paper trail, no taxes, no conscience, but he's smart. Records everything. That last part was key. Max wasn't just muscle, he was a survivor. He knew people like Robert always turn on their hired guns when the cleanup's done. So he'd been collecting proof, audio, video, receipts, a lifeline for the day things turned ugly. Tank leaned forward, his voice low, deliberate. You work for a man who pays in crypto and leaves no witnesses. You think you're special, Max? You think you're gonna be the one guy he lets walk away clean? Max smirked but didn't answer. Tank slid a photo across the table. A screenshot Rico had pulled from Robert's encrypted server. It was an internal message chain labeled Phase 2, Containment. Next to the word containment was Max Steele's name. That got his attention. He blinked once, jaw tightening. He's planning to get rid of me? Tank didn't flinch. He's done it before. Ask Kevin Walsh. Rico pulled out another tablet and pressed play. Kevin's name appeared in one of Robert's archived emails. The journalist was persistent. Handle it quietly. Max's face shifted, the cocky indifference fading into something sharper. Fear. Rico spoke softly, almost kindly. Robert's been sloppy. He used the same crypto wallets for your payment as he did for the shell companies tied to that journalist's disappearance. You're not his partner, Max. You're his next loose end. For a long moment, the only sound in the diner was the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Then Max sighed and pushed the flash drive toward Tank. Everything's on there, he said finally. Every job, every call, every order. You take him down, I disappear. That's the deal. Tank didn't move to grab it. You're gonna do more than hand over a flash drive, he said. You're gonna testify. You're gonna help us make sure he never hurts anyone again. Max shook his head. You don't get it. You're talking about a man with reach. Lawyers, cops, politicians. He's protected. Rico smirked. Protected until the internet sees what's on that drive. When we plugged it into Rico's laptop, the truth spilled out like poison. There were dozens of recordings. Robert's voice, crisp and unmistakable, giving explicit orders. One file was labeled Evans Incident. My stomach turned as I listened to his voice say, "She needs a warning. Make it painful, but not fatal." I had to walk away from the table to keep from shaking, but that wasn't the worst of it. Another recording, dated 18 months earlier, carried Robert's voice again. This time, colder, harder. The journalist won't stop. Take care of it, permanently. Rico froze the playback, his eyes meeting mine. This isn't just assault, it's murder. Tank leaned back, a grim smile curling across his face. We don't need to expose him, he said quietly. He's about to expose himself. Midnight. A shovel. A man sweating under moonlight whispering, "We have to move the body." I was watching from the shadows. The air in the Maple Hollow Memorial Rose Garden felt heavier than it ever had before. Thick with dew, tension, and the smell of damp soil. It was the same patch of land Robert Kingsley had billed as a $3.6 million landscaping project. The same one where the numbers never added up. For months, I'd stared at invoices and schematics, wondering what could possibly justify that price tag. Now I knew. The roses weren't the only thing buried there. Rico had used ground-penetrating radar earlier that week, quietly, after pulling a few strings with a friend in city maintenance. The scan had shown something strange, irregular soil density beneath the central flower bed. It was exactly where Robert's invoices had claimed the foundation irrigation work had taken place. Only, there was no foundation. Rico's voice had been steady when he told us, "Whatever's under there, it's not irrigation lines." That's when Tank came up with the plan. If he buried a body there, he's gonna want to move it once he knows we're digging. It was bold, risky, maybe even insane, but it was the only way to catch Robert confessing in real time. The trap was simple. Make him believe the bikers had found his secret and that he had one last chance to clean it up before it surfaced. Max agreed to be the bait. Wearing a wire under his denim jacket, he called Robert late that night, pretending to be in a full-blown panic. Rico and I listened to the call from a van parked a few blocks away, the computer screens glowing against the dark. "They know about the garden," Max said, his voice trembling with just the right amount of fear. "The bikers, they've got equipment out there. They're gonna dig him up." Robert's reply was a whisper that chilled the entire van. "Meet me there in 30 minutes. Bring a shovel. We'll move him." By the time Robert arrived, the moon had risen high, painting the roses in ghostly silver light. His expensive loafers sank into the mud as he approached the center of the garden, glancing nervously around. "Where are they?" he demanded. Max pointed to the flower bed. "There, that's where they scanned." Robert's breathing quickened. "We don't have time," he muttered, grabbing the shovel from Max and driving it into the soil. Every word, every motion, was being recorded and live-streamed through Rico's encrypted feed. Tens of thousands of viewers were already watching. HOA victims, journalists, even a few law enforcement insiders Rico had tipped off anonymously. The chat feed on the laptop scrolled so fast it blurred. People couldn't believe what they were witnessing. As Robert dug, he talked, as if he needed to explain himself to no one and everyone at once. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he panted. The journalist wouldn't stop. He was going to ruin everything. The camera caught the sweat dripping from his forehead, the soil caked under his nails. He was confessing, and he didn't even realize it. I stood with Tank behind a cluster of hedges, watching through a thermal scope, my pulse hammering in my ears. Rico whispered into the earpiece, "We've got him. Everything's live." The longer Robert talked, the deeper his hole, both literal and metaphorical, became. He rambled about money, about contracts, about necessary sacrifices. His voice cracked, and for the first time, he sounded human. Not powerful, not untouchable, just broken. Then suddenly his hand went to his jacket, and my stomach dropped. The blast lit the garden like daylight, and when the smoke cleared, Robert Kingsley was face down in the dirt he'd killed for. The world seemed to split in half between the roar of the flashbang and the high-pitched ringing in my ears. For one breathless second, everything froze. The roses, the mist, the broken shovel hanging in the air like a symbol of everything he'd destroyed. Then time snapped back, and I saw Robert sprawled on the ground, coughing, eyes wide, hands clawing for the pistol he'd just drawn. It had happened so fast. The moment Robert reached into his jacket, Tank moved, a blur of leather and muscle. He tossed the flashbang he'd prepped hours earlier, a little silver canister that hit the ground between them and exploded with a deafening crack. The garden lit up in a white-hot pulse, a shockwave rippling through the air like thunder trapped in a bottle. Max hit the dirt instantly, covering his head, while Tank lunged forward. By the time the smoke cleared, he had Robert pinned, one knee in his back, zip ties already snapping around his wrists. Rico's voice came through my earpiece, steady and urgent. "Cameras are still live. We've got everything." The livestream hadn't gone down. Despite the flash, despite the chaos, the feed was still rolling, broadcasting every second to the tens of thousands of people watching from their homes, their phones, their offices, people who'd once been silenced by corrupt HOAs, now watching justice in real time. On screen, the chat was exploding. "He confessed. He confessed." Robert groaned, his designer jacket streaked with mud. His perfect suburban composure, the one he'd used to manipulate, intimidate, and steal, was gone. "You don't understand," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "I was protecting the community. He was going to destroy everything." Tank didn't say a word. He just tightened the restraints, eyes like steel. "You destroyed yourself," he muttered. From where I stood behind the hedge, I could see the truth unraveling under the moonlight. The disturbed patch of soil was clearly visible now, darker and uneven. And just beneath Robert's knees, the edge of a plastic tarp was beginning to show. Rico's ground scan had been right. He hadn't just confessed to murder. He'd led us straight to the body. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Blue and red lights cut through the fog as the first police cruisers pulled up along the park entrance. Tank raised his hands immediately, stepping back from Robert with the calm of a man who knew he'd just done the right thing. "Over here!" he shouted to the officers. "The man you're looking for is right here." The officers swarmed in, weapons drawn, their flashlights slicing through the smoke. When they saw Robert, the once untouchable president of the Maple Hollow HOA, zip-tied in the dirt with his own pistol lying beside him, the lead detective didn't hesitate. "You're under arrest for murder, Mr. Kingsley," he said flatly, reading him his rights as Rico's camera caught every word. The police cordoned off the garden within minutes, uncovering the tarp and the remains beneath it, confirmation of everything we already knew. The memorial plaque that once read "Dedicated to Community Harmony" now sat beside a shallow grave. Robert stopped struggling then. He looked up, face pale, eyes darting between the officers, the cameras, and the dark silhouettes of Tank and me standing side by side. For the first time, he realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. But justice wasn't over. Not until I faced him myself. He looked smaller in handcuffs. I leaned forward and said, "You tried to break my family. Now watch yours fall apart." The words felt like a verdict coming out of my mouth, calm and unstoppable. It was strange, seeing the man who had chaired every neighborhood meeting with such arrogant ease suddenly tremble as deputies read him his rights. The cameras were everywhere. The live feed Rico had set up had already been clipped and shared 1,000 times. For days afterward, strangers told me they'd watched the moment over and over. A community that once feared him, now replaying his collapse like a kind of exorcism. Within hours, the local news picked up the live stream. Within a day, national outlets were running the footage. Reporters wanted names, timelines, proof. I gave what I could. The forged invoices I'd found, the crypto trail Rico had traced, Max's recordings, and the garden footage where Robert had incriminated himself. I felt like a conductor in a symphony of evidence. Each piece a note that, when played together, became unbearable for anyone who still doubted. The narrative was simple and savage. A man who'd weaponized community trust to vanish millions, and silence questions had been exposed right in the dirt he'd hoped would bury the truth. The FBI took the case within 48 hours. Men in plain suits showed up at my door politely, but with the kind of presence that changes the tone of a room. They were interested in patterns, other HOAs, other shell companies, other victims. And when I told them about the invoices that funneled money to businesses that existed only on paper, their faces tightened. Within a week, subpoenas went out to banks, shell companies were traced, and federal auditors began the slow, arithmetic task of unwinding years of carefully buried theft. The phrase they kept using in closed-door conversations was chillingly bureaucratic, organized municipal fraud. It was worse than embezzlement. It was systemic. People I hardly knew started showing up at our door with boxes of bank statements and notarized affidavits. Homeowners I'd only met once at a board meeting came forward with identical stories of unexplained charges and intimidation tactics. Testimony accumulated like rainfall after a long drought. The press called it a HOA crime ring. Federal agents called it a sprawling network spanning multiple counties. I watched as my little blog, once a hobby and a civic duty, turned into a focal point for a national conversation about accountability in the shadowy corners of suburban governance. Publicly confronting Robert at the garden that night felt both inevitable and surreal. He tried to muster a smirk as deputies escorted him past the cameras, but it curled like a wound. I didn't shout. There was no need. I simply walked to the police tape, looked him in the eye, and said what so many in our community had wanted to say for years. "You used our trust as a ledger. You treated people like invoices. Now you'll answer for every line." He had nothing left to say that hadn't already been recorded. His arrogance had been edited into evidence. The outrage spread beyond our cul-de-sac. Legislators cited the case in hearings. Consumer advocates called for new transparency laws governing HOAs. My inbox filled with offers to appear on panels and podcasts, and with invitations to testify at hearings about municipal oversight. The footage from that night continued to trend, turning raw anger into organized reform. I kept thinking of Kevin Walsh, the journalist whose last work had named some of the same entities I'd uncovered. It mattered that the truth finally had a megaphone. The trial loomed like a mountain. I knew a courtroom could deliver a verdict, but a verdict alone wouldn't rebuild what had been stolen or soothe every frightened neighbor. Still, as cameras and subpoenas multiplied, I felt a resolve deepen in me. Conviction wasn't the end. It was the first step. The courtroom would be the place where names were recorded, assets seized, and justice stamped into public record. But even as I prepared for that fight, I was already thinking beyond it, about systemic change, about law reform, about preventing the next Kingsley from rising. The trial would deliver justice, but I was already planning what came next. They broke my husband's arm to silence me. Instead, they built my platform. The day Robert Kingsley was sentenced, the courthouse smelled of coffee and rain, the kind of gray morning that fits the end of a long storm. The courtroom was packed, the same neighbors who once whispered behind closed doors now filling the benches shoulder to shoulder. Robert shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, his hair unkempt, his face pale. He tried to straighten his posture, to reclaim that old authority, but the arrogance that once held entire meetings captive was gone. When the judge pronounced life in prison without parole, he barely blinked. Maybe he'd already resigned himself to the walls that would define him for the rest of his life. The restitution order was staggering. Over $8 million seized from shell accounts and property sales, redirected to the victims of his schemes. Families who'd nearly lost their homes were getting checks in the mail. For many, it wasn't just money. It was closure. I sat beside Jake, his hand wrapped around mine. The same hand they'd tried to destroy was strong again. Healed. We didn't say much during the sentencing. We didn't need to. The sound of the gavel, the shuffle of paperwork, and the low murmur of reporters filled the air. The soundtrack of justice served. After Robert's conviction, Maple Hollow changed overnight. The HOA that had ruled every lawn, every mailbox, every breath of the neighborhood was dissolved by unanimous vote. In its place rose something new. A resident-led council, transparent and open. Every expenditure was public. Every decision required community consent. The bylaws that once read like threats now read like promises. For the first time, Maple Hollow truly belonged to its residents. The Memorial Rose Garden, the very ground where Robert buried his sins, was transformed. The town hired a new landscaping team, and together, we tore it down to the roots. When the soil was turned and the tarp removed, we replanted it with wild roses and small white lilies. At the center, we placed a single bronze plaque that read, "The Truth Garden," in memory of Kevin Walsh, whose voice was buried but never silenced. On the day of its dedication, the community gathered quietly as Kevin's sister laid the first bouquet. Even Tank, a man not easily moved, bowed his head. Meanwhile, my blog, Household Justice, exploded beyond anything I'd imagined. What began as a local watchdog became a national movement. I started hosting interviews with victims of HOA corruption, whistleblowers, and legal experts. I spoke at city halls and universities, warning homeowners about the dangers of unchecked power in community associations. News outlets began citing my posts. Lawmakers reached out, eager to draft legislation that would demand transparency from HOAs nationwide. What had started as one woman's outrage had become a platform for reform. Tank and the Iron Vultures became legends in their own right. They stopped being seen as outlaws and started being seen as protectors. Local police, once wary of them, began partnering with the club for community watch initiatives. They escorted women leaving abusive homes, patrolled neighborhoods plagued by threats, and helped veterans in crisis. Tank never sought credit, but word spread fast. People who once crossed the street to avoid a biker jacket now waved when they saw the vultures riding through town. Steel serves better than fear, Tank told me once. It's not about vengeance, it's about balance. Rico built something too, using the skills that had once danced on the line between legal and criminal. He launched a cybersecurity firm that specialized in auditing HOA and municipal systems for fraud. He called it Open Site Solutions. Within a year, his team had uncovered misappropriations in 5 different communities, saving homeowners millions. Funny, he said one night. Turns out hacking for good pays a lot better than hiding in the dark. As for me, I still write every day. I write about corruption and courage, about the quiet heroes who refuse to be bullied into silence. Jake sits beside me when I post, his healed hand steady over mine. Every so often I'll hear the low growl of Harleys passing down the street. Tanks men, still watching, still guarding. That sound no longer frightens me. It reminds me of how far we've come. Sometimes I visit the Truth Garden alone. The flowers bloom thicker every season, wild and bright. I touch the plaque, whisper a thank you to Kevin Walsh, and to everyone who refused to look away. Because that's the secret about justice. It doesn't always arrive clean or polite. It can be loud, messy, forged from steel and courage and community. Justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it rides a Harley.